Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Elizabeth Aaron. I hope you are all faring well and continuing to do great self-care during this shelter-in-place time. I know a lot of people are starting to feel antsy and wanting to get out and about. I know I've been feeling it, and I've pushed myself a bit harder, only to come down with a seasonal cold. I know I'll be fine. But it is scary these days. Any little hiccup in your health, and you start wondering, have I been following all the protocols? Have I been doing everything right? And in fact, that's why I missed last Thursday's podcast. I just wasn't well enough to record. So my wish for all of you is that you do take good care, be cautious, and stay vigilant about taking care of yourself. Stay home and watch lots of movies. And for today's podcast, you may notice my voice is a little rough. So I hope you can appreciate the added character that I'm bringing to today's show. Today I'm going to be talking about 4 movies that I saw on Netflix. I just had not heard of them before, and they looked interesting, and I thought I'd just try something new. No super rhyme or reason to why I chose these particular movies, but interestingly, I did notice that these movies happen to have a common theme, which is centered around men leaving. In the first segment, I'll be talking about the movie Breath, which is the debut feature film directed by Simon Baker. If you aren't familiar with Simon Baker, he's a wonderful actor and is known for the TV series The Mentalist and The Guardian. In the second segment of the show, I'll be talking about an independent movie called Burning Cane, and it turns out the director of this movie is just 20 years old, and the movie walked away with some awards from the Tribeca Film Festival. In the third segment of the show, I'll be sharing my thoughts on the movie Chronically Metropolitan, which stars Noth and Mary-Louise Parker. And then stick around for the end of the show, and I'll be talking about the movie Wakefield, which stars Bryan, Cranston, and Jennifer Garner, and whose director was nominated for an Oscar for the screenplay The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. So let's dive on in. So the movie Breath. This came out in 2018. It's an hour and 55 minutes long. It is rated TVMA, and that means mature audiences because there's some nudity, language, and smoking. It is considered a drama, a romance, and a sport movie, but I'd also add that it is a coming-of-age movie for sure. It's based on a novel by the same name by Tim Winton, and the novel was published in 2008, and it had won the Miles Franklin Literary Award. Now, this movie was nominated for 6 awards at the 8th Australian Academy of Cinema and Television Arts Awards, and it won 2. It won Best Supporting Actor for Simon Baker, and it won Best Sound. It was also nominated for Best Film, Best Direction, Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Supporting Actress, and that was for Elizabeth Debicki, Best Cinematography, and Best Editing. So Simon Baker is the co-writer of the screenplay with Gerard Lee, and he also co-produced the film. Now, he directed it, and he also starred in it, so he had a lot of roles in this. And prior to directing this movie, he had directed some episodes of the hit series The Mentalist that he was in 2008, and also he directed one episode of The Guardian. He had starred in both of those TV series, but in terms of movies, this was Simon Baker's first motion picture that he directed. Besides being in these major television series, He'd been in some movies. He was in LA Confidential, Sunset Strip, and The Devil Wears Prada, among others. And in this movie, he plays the character Sando. Now, the cast includes two other young men, and their names are Samson Coulter, who plays the character Pikelet, and there's Ben Spence, who plays the character Looney. Now, this is the first major role for both of these boys. Apparently, it took them about a year to find them. The characteristics that they were advertising for getting actors for these roles were they were around the age 13, 14, and they had had some surfing experience. They didn't necessarily have to have acting experience. Well, these two just hit it out of the park. They searched high and low to find the right actors, and I think they certainly landed on two that made these roles pop. And in fact, Ben Spence, who plays the character Looney, he was nominated for Best Actor Supporting Role by the Film Critics Circle of Australian Awards for this movie. And also starring in this movie is the actress Elizabeth Debicki. She was nominated as Best Supporting Actress for the Australian Academy of Cinema and Television Arts Awards for this movie, and she won Best Lead Actress in a Television Drama for The Kettering Incident, and she won Best Supporting Actress for The Great Gatsby by the same awards organization. She has starred in The Great Gatsby, clearly, Macbeth, Everest, and The Burnt Orange Heresy. When I saw this movie listed on Netflix, I was just kind of curious about it. It looked like it was a surfing movie, and it took place in Australia, all things that I thought might be fascinating. But then I saw it had Simon Baker connected with it, and I really like him a lot, and I thought it would be super interesting to see what his directorial debut would be like. He did not disappoint. This movie was really well crafted. It had some holes, but overall I felt it was well put together, and the acting was great. I stayed involved throughout the movie. So let me tell you more about the story. The movie starts off with a voiceover. It's an older man. You can tell he is looking back on his childhood, and he is talking about the theme of fear. He shares how he met Looney when he was swimming in a river, and they became fast friends. But Looney seemed to have no sense of fear. He would just give everything his all, as if his life was never really at risk. And this is the character Pikelet talking. His last name is Pike, so they called him Pikelet. And he is an only child. His parents are very conservative, simple, not very doting, and they give their son a lot of free rein to do whatever he wants. There are moments that they might invite him to do something with them, and he'll say that he has other plans, and you can see that the parents are kind of disappointed and crushed, but they see there's no point in arguing and just let him do what he wants. Now, Looney, as we eventually see, is kind of nuts. We learn that he was raised in more of an abusive household, and he just constantly pushes the envelope. For example, he and Pikelet are riding their bikes, and a truck passes by, and Looney catches the end of the truck, and the truck speeds up, and it goes faster and faster, and there are two young adults sitting in the bed of the truck, and they're telling him to let go, that he is going to be in danger. And in fact, he does get into danger. We don't actually see what happens, but we see afterwards that he and Pikelet are in the back of the truck with the other two, their bikes are back there with them, and Looney's knees are all scraped up. But they are all super content to be in the back of that truck. And they eventually make it to the ocean, and they are watching surfers out on the water. And this is the first time that Looney and Pikelet have seen surfers, and they are enthralled. As the voiceover described it, it is such a beautiful thing, surfing. Yet it seems so pointless, and yet it was so elegant. So Looney and Pikelet then set out on a mission to be able to get their own surfboards, and together they start their new hobby. They are obsessed. They are willing to ride their little bikes, carrying their surfboards. It's super awkward. It takes them a lot of time and energy to get to the beach, but they do it. And one day they're on their way home from surfing, and they run into this guy who's driving his VW pickup, and he asks them about their age and what their interest is in surfing, and he invites them to leave their surfboards at his house, which is just up the road. This encounter then changes everything for them, because eventually they find out that this man, his name is Sando, He lives in this sort of hippie pad with his wife. Well, he was a champion surfer, and he starts mentoring them. And surfing becomes much more than a hobby. It starts to become a way of life, as well as a passion. And then they get to know his wife, played by Elizabeth Debicki. Her character in the movie is Eva, and she clearly has an injury. She has trouble walking. And she has this kind of sarcasm towards her husband and his continued passion for doing surfing. But also how he's becoming friends with these very young kids. Over time, more and more is revealed about this couple to these boys. We also see how surfing affects them. And we start to see the impact that surfing has on them in their personal lives. There's a point where Pikelet sees someone in need on the road. And it is obvious that it's because of the confidence that he's gained from his surfing that he is in a position where he volunteers to help. And ultimately, this story really is Pikelet's. We get to see how there is a young love that is budding for him at school. And we get to see how he becomes more and more independent from his parents. Something that I thought was really incredible about this movie, and maybe it was just based on the age that the boys were at the time the filming happened, but you actually really see them grow. Their voices get deeper, they seem to get taller. I don't know if some of it was a trick with the camera or makeup or something, but throughout the movie it does seem that they grow from young kids into young men. There's a lot more that happens in Pikelet's story in terms of his relationship with Sando and Elizabeth and Looney. But it's very involved and I don't want to ruin it for you. Suffice it to say that between the surfing and his relationships with these people, he figures out for himself what fear means and what it means to be able to have courage and to go beyond the fear and to follow your own heart. I love how different details and relationships unravel in this movie. You are right there beside the protagonist experiencing what he's experiencing and seeing these characters for who they are. There's also some great subtext in this movie. That is to say, there are moments where the audience has information that the characters don't, and there are moments that the characters have information that the audience doesn't have. And as a result of these circumstances, the audience stays involved and they keep wanting to understand what the emotional journey is of the protagonist, but actually all of the characters. There's a point in the movie where Pikelet and Eva's relationship changes, and as I thought about it, what happens makes complete sense. It's hard to imagine the story going in a different direction. However, the way that the relationship changes, I didn't exactly buy. It was done well, but it didn't seem natural to me. And it had the potential to be a little far-fetched. And there are some other holes in the movie. For example, I did find it hard to believe that Pikelet's parents were as uninvolved and lenient with him as they were. And also, we never see the parents meet Sando. And yet he is taking these kids out on these dangerous waves. And you'd think that there would be more responsibility shown in this movie around getting permission for the kids to go and for the parents to care about what the qualifications were of Sando. There's also a point where Sando gets to go away with Looney to do some surfing. And this is far away, into another country. And Looney's parents, I can't even imagine that they would have approved of this, that they would have had money for it, or that Looney even would have had a passport. It all just magically happened. And that was a little bit disappointing. At the same time, this movie did some things really well. For example, everything about the surfing. It was lovely how we saw the boys just be introduced to surfing from seeing it on the beach and growing to the point that they have a certain level of expertise. And I found myself getting as enthralled about surfing and wanting to up the ante about what else you could do as much as the boys did themselves. They had no qualms about getting up at 4:30, 5 in the morning to be able to make a great surf. And I was caught up in that same passion with them. And I loved Sando's interaction with these boys. He had such a zest for life, which is in great contrast to what both of the boys' fathers had. Pikelet's dad is very quiet. He likes to sit in a boat on the lake. He doesn't have a desire to move out closer to the ocean or by the surf. He likes to fiddle with things in his workshop and play in the garden. Meanwhile, Looney's dad seems to be a rough guy. He has no qualms about using physical abuse, and he's really looking out for himself. There's a point where he asks Looney and Pikelet to do some work for him, and Looney bargains with him about how much they'll get paid. And his father acts very much like a businessman trying to get the best deal, as opposed to thinking about this is his son and that he might actually be teaching his son something. I also liked how the movie slowly paced this relationship that Pikelet has with this young woman who is going to school with him. We see how this relationship evolves over time, from riding on the bus together, to how they make a connection together, to how they study together. Their relationship has its own metamorphosis, and it's handled very well. And I loved Elizabeth Debicki in this movie. I wish she had had a bigger part, because she did a great job. She's really more of a supporting character, but her personality is very clear. As a member of the audience, I have so much compassion for her and her wanting to have the life that she had before her accident, but her life is completely changed as a result of the accident. And the passion that Sando and the boys have for surfing lies directly in her face, and this helps us understand her more, but also to explore fear more, and if you are fearless, what has the potential to happen. At the end of the movie, we get to see how each of these characters has grown, and the path that they choose to pursue. And I will say, I came out of this movie feeling like something happened. It felt like a lot of time passed, and I felt like I learned something deeply inside, the same thing that Pikelet had learned about what was important in terms of what you want out of life, the risks that you're willing to take, and what fear and courage really mean to you as an individual. Another reflection I have about this movie is just the filming. So much of it was based on surfing and the waves, and some big waves. It must have been a tremendous undertaking in order to film out in the sea. According to the Internet Movie Database, all of the crew were on call. At a moment's notice, they needed to drop whatever they were doing when the temperature and the weather and all the elements were right so that they could film appropriately. Also, something else that the Internet Movie Database noted was that most of the scenes, the majority of them, of the surfing, were the actors themselves doing it. So my hat's off to them. This was really a lovely movie, a reflective, mature movie. And of the 4 movies that I watched to talk about today, I would say this is the one that stuck with me the most. So on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being a most excellent, fantastic movie, what would I rate this? I would give it an 8. The acting was great, the story was involved, it was a beautiful picture to watch. It had a lot going for it. Other than a few of the holes, I felt it was solid, and I would recommend it. Stay tuned for the next segment of the show, when I'll be looking at the movie Burning Cane after the break.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Thanks for joining in the second segment of the show. I am your host, Elizabeth Aaron. In the last segment, I talked about the movie Breath. I'm now going to discuss the movie Burning Cane. Burning Cane came out in 2019. It is rated TV MA, meaning mature audiences. That's because there's some language and smoking. This is a shorter movie. It's 1 hour and 18 minutes long, and it is a drama. And this movie won the Jury Award for Best Narrative Feature, Best Actor, and Cinematography at the Tribeca Film Festival. And this movie was written and directed by Phillip Youmans. He's directed a number of short films, and this is his first feature film. He is 20 years old. And for this movie, he also won a special mention at the Athens International Film Festival for international competition. I would say this story and its depth goes way beyond the years of this young director. So I have a feeling we're going to be seeing a lot more of him. And he also got quite a good cast for this movie. The most known actor in the movie is Wendell Pierce, and he's known for TV roles in the series Third Watch, Law and Order, The Wire, and Tom Clancy's Jack Ryan. And he's been in several movies, including Selma, The Gift, and One Last Thing. And in the Black Reel Awards, he won Outstanding Supporting Actor Motion Picture for Selma. So that is quite a coup for this young director to have such a well-known actor in his film. Other actors are Karen Kaya Livers, and she had TV roles on Dream, NCIS New Orleans, and One Mississippi. And she's been in the movies Speech and Debate, 1 Mile to You, and Queen and Slim. And also in this movie is Dominic McClellan. He is a relatively new actor and has been in the movies Breakout and Woke. As I mentioned before, I saw this movie on Netflix, and Netflix's summary of this movie is a lonely mother, an unemployed son, a grieving pastor, all desperate, all questioning their faith, and all too human. This is a really interesting movie in how the characters are intertwined. You see these three main characters, each in their own element. And essentially there are only about 3 locations in the movie, so you can tell that it is a low-budget movie. And yet this movie does a lot with what little it has. And yet it has quite an interesting tone to it. All of the characters are African American, and none of them are particularly well off. They all seem to have major problems. And I believe this movie takes place in the Bayou in Louisiana. The protagonist is Karen Kaya Livers' character, whose name is Helen Wayne. Her son is played by Dominic McClellan, Daniel Wayne, and Wendell Pierce plays the Reverend Tillman. Helen Wayne is the protagonist of this movie, and she does the voiceover and narrative. The movie starts off with her talking about her best friend, which is Jojo, her dog. And she talks about how Jojo has this itch and all these different things that she tried to treat the itch, and it just doesn't seem to disappear. It seems that this is symbolic of kind of what's to come in the rest of the movie. There is this unrest among the people in the movie. It's like they have their own inner itch that they can't seem to relieve. And she also talks in terms of her dog that many people keep saying that she should just take him out to the fields and kill him because it'll put him out of his misery. But she believes that it's really only God who can say when he will die. And in a similar way with these characters, it seems to be only God who can maybe give them some level of relief if they're willing to listen. After we see Helen's opening, we then see the church and the Reverend giving a sermon. And over time in this movie, I found myself having so much compassion for this Reverend. There was a lot of pressure on him to be a stand-up man of God, and yet his own wife has recently passed away, and he is grieving. He doesn't seem to be able to show his own vulnerability about his own circumstances with the churchgoers. And yet we see a point where Helen approaches him because he has been drinking and he's about to drive, and he is trusting God to guide him. Helen offers to drive him home, but he refuses, and he is taking some risks then into his own hands. And next we see a scene with Helen's son, Daniel. It is late at night, and he is taking care of his young boy. But he himself has been drinking, and I'll just say he is not treating his boy the way a parent should. Late into the night, a woman comes home, and she starts cleaning up beer cans in the area. The assumption is that this is his wife and the boy's mother. And as is revealed, each of these people is somehow connected to Helen. And hence, as the protagonist, she's the one who connects the dots of how these characters interact, and they make up her world. And we keep seeing her interact with each of them, and it ends up being kind of like a spiral. And you get to see how things get wound up and reach kind of a fever pitch with her. This story is well crafted, and in each situation, there is a very specific conflict that is happening. So there's something to be worked out in all of these relationships. With each sermon that the Reverend gives, it appears that he is talking about a theme that correlates to what else is going on within the relationships that Helen has. And when we see Helen at the beginning talking about the dog, and we see her walk, she has a limp, she's overweight, she struggles to move. It's a very slow-paced movie. You can tell it is filmed in a location where it's very hot, and the characters move at a pace as if it is very hot and it takes any little bit of energy just to move because of the heat. And ultimately, we just want relief for Helen, for her dog, and as long as there are issues with these other people who are important to her in her life, she doesn't have any relief. The acting in this movie is quite good, and with these three main characters, this is really a character study. And each character is put in their own circumstance, and then for each of them, their circumstance shifts a little bit, and you get to see how or if they're going to change. In the slowness of this all, it was really wonderful to watch the character work that was being done. Each of the characters was deep, they had their own wants and needs and purpose, and they each demonstrated their own flaws. In terms of the story, you wonder if the Reverend is going to ever get past the death of his wife. And as for Daniel, he's in a lot of pain. He's lost his job, he lies about it, he's taking care of his son, and interestingly, both he and the Reverend seem to have a drinking problem. And yet we get to see how each of them deals with this problem. Will they both see the light? Will one see the light and one stay in the darkness? I won't give it away, but it's something to look for. And this is ultimately Helen's story. And we get to see what kind of character she is, the kind of responsibility she feels she needs to take as a result of the actions of these two men. I would say I stayed intrigued throughout the movie. It kept my attention. I kept wanting to know what was going on in these characters' minds. Why were they doing the things that they were doing? And from the bat, I cared about Helen because of how much she cared about her dog. And I wanted to see how this was going to impact her and how she would handle it. So in that way, this movie has a lot going for it. At the same time, I feel there are areas that there could be improvements made. Some of the scenes in cinematography are great. In other scenes, though, the lighting is so dark that sometimes I had trouble figuring out who the characters were that were in the scene. There were some other women characters in the movie, and I wasn't always tracking whether it was Helen or a different character who was there. Sometimes scenes were shot in completely different rooms that I'd never seen before, so it was hard to pick out who was there in that particular environment. And while the characters are all very different, their voices were not always so different in terms of the women and the men. So this did cause me some confusion in figuring out who was speaking, what was happening when, why was this important for this particular character. And some of the relationships weren't completely clear to me either. Now, I think Helen worked at the church, which is why she took extra interest in the Reverend and his drinking issue, but it wasn't completely clear to me. Or if she was just trying to be a caring citizen or a caring member of the church, and that's why she was helping the Reverend. And then there's the woman who came into Daniel's home where he was caring for his son Jeremiah. Like I said, I think it was his wife, but maybe there was some other relationship. There are also lots of actions that are hints of things. There's a point where Daniel and the woman, whose name I believe is Sherry, get into an argument. We know something happens, but it's not clear exactly what happens behind closed doors. And there's a point where we see Helen with a shotgun. And we know that this is probably going to show up again in the movie, and yet it's hard to tell why she has the shotgun at all. I think ultimately it does play a key role. It just wasn't clear enough. As a result, this really did force this piece for me to become just more of a character study than a full story. I was intrigued and I liked watching the actors, and I think that they connected well, and yet I kept questioning for myself, was I missing something? Was this me or was it the movie? I didn't really have an answer, but either way, it fell short for me. And as I mentioned before, all of the characters are African American, and they're all in such pain and have their issues, alcohol or body pain or past problems that they're having trouble getting over. And it seems like it's the Reverend's sermons at the church that are the main salve that they can put on these wounds, and they may or may not work. For example, Daniel has pretty much sworn off the church, and so that is no help to him. But in terms of Black Lives Matter, I have a feeling that this movie very much shares with the real experiences of Black people who live in these rural areas that are poor. And in that way, this movie is definitely eye-opening. There's this feeling that all there is suffering. There's very little to look forward to. There's not a lot of joy. There's just surviving, with a little relief from a Sunday sermon. There seems to be a need for them to pick each other up, and yet none of them seem to have the reserves to really be able to do that to the extent that's needed. So in that way, this movie is also a dark movie. Not literally because of the darkness in the scenes, but also just because of the content and the characters and what they are dealing with in their everyday lives. There's a point where the Reverend is doing a sermon where he talks about the devil. And this seems to parallel with the scene where Daniel is visiting his mother. And there is a sense that there is something about the devil and that sermon that is coming out because there's a voiceover of the Reverend while the scene is playing out with the mother and her son. I had a sense of what was going on here. I don't want to give it away. But this does seem to be a point where the three of them kind of converge in a scene, and it provides an opportunity for us to see why these three people are in this movie. So I've talked about the darkness, but I haven't talked about some of the light also. Daniel has a son, Jeremiah, and he is really cute. He spends a lot of time coloring. He does what his dad says, even though it's probably not good for him, and yet he seems to just survive. He seems to find his way to be safe and to do something that he wants and be able to keep his dad at bay. There is a point when Helen brings Jeremiah to her home, and she has an orange grove. I believe it's orange. It might be grapefruit, but I'm pretty sure it's orange on the property where she lives. She also has chicken coops, and it's hard to tell if this is property that she herself owns or if she's just living there. But in any case, Jeremiah has free reign. And there's a beautiful scene where Helen is doing voiceover talking about him, but you see him going through the orange trees and he's trying to find the orange that he wants to pick and eat. We see his innocence, we see his freedom from being out from under his father, and simply the fact that he is young and he has a life ahead of him. This is where we see some level of hope. And I'm so glad that this is in the movie. It needed some lightness to contrast with the darkness. I do think it's interesting that it seems like it is the women who are picking up the pieces for these men whose lives on some level seem to be shattered. We have Sherry, who I'm going to guess works an overnight shift or a late shift, which is why she comes home so late. And right away she's picking up trash and trying to make things nice at home. She has her priorities straight. Meanwhile, Daniel refuses to face some level of truth about the fact that he is not succeeding. He knows it and it's so painful he can't bear it. And yet, Sherry is managing to succeed on some level. And then we have Helen, who tries to set Daniel straight also, as well as the Reverend. And it's the Reverend who falls apart when his wife dies. He's grieving, and while that is completely natural and makes sense, as a man of God, his strength seems to be challenged. So this movie is not perfect, but what I like about it is it shoots for something. You can tell it's working towards doing something. It may not completely reach its goal, but it is a serious movie, and I believe it takes itself seriously. And I can really appreciate the energy and the artistry that has gone into this. It is an unusual movie, and I can't say I've seen any movie quite like it before, in terms of how the characters interact and are intertwined. And so if you want to see a movie by an up-and-coming African-American director, with a story that has some major redeeming qualities, this is a good one to watch. And it is shorter, as I said, it's an hour and 18 minutes. So it's not as big an investment in time. So if that is all of interest to you, I think it is one that is worth checking out. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being a most excellent, wonderful movie, I would give this one a 6, maybe a 7. But a lot of that is just because you can tell that this is from a new director who's working things out. Stay tuned for the next segment of the show, when I'll be looking at the movie Chronically Metropolitan after the break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome to the third segment of the show. I'm your host, Elizabeth Aaron. In the last segment, I talked about the movie Burning Cane. I'm now going to discuss the movie Chronically Metropolitan. This movie originally came out in 2016. It's an hour and 25 minutes long. It's rated TVMA, as the other movies are. That's for mature audiences. This movie has some language and smoking. It also has implications of sexual content as well as nudity. This movie is directed by Xavier Manrique. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. This was his first feature film. He had directed 2 shorts before, and he has worked as a crew member on a number of sets, but really he's pretty much a newcomer, so I am impressed that he was able to get the cast that he did, similar to the director for the last movie, Burning Cane. And this movie is considered a dark comedy. It stars Shiloh Fernandez, who plays Fenton, the main character, and he has been in the movies Evil Dead, Red Riding Hood, and The East. This movie also stars Ashley Benson. She plays Fenton's ex-girlfriend, who is Jessie, and Ashley Benson has been in a lot of television. She has been in episodes of The West Wing, Days of Our Lives, and Pretty Little Liars, and she's won several Teen Choice Awards for Pretty Little Liars. She's also been in movies including 13 Going on 30 and Elvis and Nixon. And as I mentioned earlier, also in this movie are Mary-Louise Parker and Chris Noth. Mary-Louise Parker is known for the TV miniseries Angels in America, the TV shows West Wing, Weeds, and Billions. She is known for the movies Fried Green Tomatoes, The Client, The Portrait of a Lady, and Solitary Man. And she won Golden Globes for Weeds and Angels in America, and an Emmy also for Angels in America. And Chris Noth is known for the TV series Sex and the City, Law and Order, Criminal Intent, and The Good Wife. And he's been in the movies The Perfect Man, Ben and Elsa, and White Girl. Netflix gives a summary of this movie as, a case of writer's block inspires a young novelist to return home to New York City and reconnect with his engaged ex and his bohemian parents. That to me, I think, misses the mark. At least, it wasn't clear to me that he was returning home because he had writer's block. Maybe that was a detail that I missed, but it also didn't seem crucial to the story to me. And I'm not sure I'd call his parents bohemian. I would definitely call them dysfunctional, and they do have an appreciation for the arts. I'm just not quite sure that fits. In any case, this movie is mostly Fenton's story. Fenton seems like a late 20s guy. He actually reminded me a lot of Johnny Depp, not necessarily in character, but in looks. At the opening, a plane lands, and we learn that it has landed from San Francisco, and that Fenton is on it, and he then gets a cab home. He is now in New York City. And then juxtaposed with that, we see an older man with a goatee. He comes across as an intellectual who may be in a midlife crisis, and he's driving a car with a beautiful girl in the back seat talking to him, flirting with him, offering him drugs. And then soon we see there's another girl who was hidden and was doing something that shall not be named. But with all this lavish attention of these lovely young women, there is a car accident. And meanwhile, we see Fenton arrive home. It's clear from the start that his arrival is not expected, and he also does not seem completely welcome. People are surprised and not sure what to make of his appearance. Soon we find out that he had some success as a writer, but what he wrote really hurt people, and instead of really dealing with it, he just ran away to San Francisco. Didn't give any notice, didn't tell anyone what was going on, he just left. And I think it's very telling that we have the father and son story at the beginning juxtaposed. While this is Fenton's story, it is a story about men really growing up, coming to terms with how it is that they impact other people. And Fenton is definitely a chip off the old block. He and his father are both writers, and there is some similarity between them. And there's this question about whether Fenton is going to turn into who his father has become. His father is a self-centered, narcissistic artist who seems to be able to live off the coattails of his early success in his life. People have tolerated his bad behavior because he is such an admired artist, and he has done a lot to hurt his family. In particular, his wife, who is completely questioning her marriage at this point. And also in parallel with the fact that Fenton's parents are questioning the marriage, especially his mom, we see Fenton reconnect with an old girlfriend who is engaged and married to another man, and Fenton keeps refusing to acknowledge the boundaries that she's setting around not wanting to see him or start something new with him. So this provides another track to see how closely Fenton is going to become his own person and different from his father. Will his relationship be similar to the marriage that his father had, or will Fenton become his own man? So when Fenton returns from San Francisco, we have this sense that he thinks he's returning home to the same home that he had left a year ago, only to find out that things are very different. First time we see his mom is with a friend of Fenton's who is known to sell marijuana. And we learn about the father situation, and we find out that the father is all about appearances, and he wants the whole family to come to the hospital in case there's any press there, and it will show that even though the father was found with these two younger women, his family is still there to support him. I think the choices that are made here are fascinating. The father has done something that is pretty unspeakable, and yet the family is still showing up to help save face. This I did not completely understand. Meanwhile, Fenton keeps pursuing Jessie. He refuses to give up on the idea that now that he's come back to New York, they are going to be a thing again. After he sees her at a party and meets her fiancé and refuses to hear no as an answer to him. Another day, he goes to a gallery that she and her fiancé seem to own, and this will be the site of their wedding. They had invited him, said that it was open if he wanted to check it out, but it was based on the premise that he was going to keep the boundary and mind his own business. So he shows up, and it is clear that he and Jessie still have chemistry, and it's tough for her to try to hold this boundary, and he is not helping at all. At the same time, we see his father dealing with his mother. His mother decides to walk out and go stay with a man friend that she has. And the father cannot stop pursuing his wife, even though he is the one that hurt her badly. Having been interested in these other young women and having got into a very public accident and being caught with the women, not to mention he hurt himself physically because his leg is broken. These men continue to push the envelope. And meanwhile, we see the friend who was the marijuana dealer start to have a relationship with Fenton's sister. This relationship is in great contrast to these other two relationships that we see in the movie. The friend's name is John, and he is kind and respectful to the sister, and the way this relationship is forming is helping him question how he wants to move forward in making a living with his life, and if selling marijuana is the way to do that. Ultimately, he is second-guessing everything because he has a reason to be better than he was before. Interestingly, he has less at stake in a way. He's just sort of an ordinary guy trying to figure out how to make life work versus these artists, these men who are writers who have made a name for themselves and they're more in the public eye. But John shows them how it's done. And in terms of Fenton, both John and Jessie call him to the carpet. They let him know how he treated them and wake him up to the fact that if he continues behaving the way that he had before, he will probably never see them again. Ultimately, this is a pretty simple movie. We see Fenton come home. We see the family go to the hospital. We see Fenton go to a party and get reacquainted with Jessie. He then goes to the gallery, keeps pursuing Jessie. We see the father and mother try and grapple with where their relationship is at. And then we see how these men wrestle with these relationships. That is pretty much it. Frankly, at the top of the movie, I didn't find any of these characters very compelling. I didn't like them. I guess it's like that saying when you start at rock bottom, there's only one way to go, and that's up. So at the beginning, the behavior of these men was despicable. I didn't like them. And frankly, I didn't like the behavior of the women either. I say Jessie was the most passable, then maybe the sister. But by the end of the movie, I felt that especially the male characters did learn. And they learned a really hard lesson. And I felt that the movie redeemed itself and these characters redeemed themselves. It was an uncomfortable journey to go on. These characters started out doing things that I personally would have never imagined being involved with. As a comedy, there was a lot that was being done over the top, and I didn't believe all of it was credible. Overall, the movie was well done. The acting was good. I just didn't care for the story. I'm glad that it ended the way it did. I did feel pretty complete with it. But I can't say that I enjoyed this movie. I'm not sure I even understand the title, Chronically Metropolitan. This family is definitely a metropolitan family. I'm not sure if this title is alluding to the fact that most families that live in cities like New York are always up to no good. I'm not sure what the title was pointing to. Now, all that said, there were some fun moments in this movie. One moment was particularly funny, and this was after the family had gone to the hospital to get the father. They get into a cab, and this family is so outspoken and so raunchy and so inappropriate that as they have this conversation in the cab, no boundaries, no sense of privacy or caring what the cab driver hears. It turns out he is on the phone, hands-free, talking to his wife. And as she's hearing about the despicable things that they're discussing, she thinks that the cab driver is involved with the things that they're talking about. And what ensues is just uncomfortable moment-by-moment, blow-by-blow event. There's also a pretty funny scene when the father meets one of the women who was in the car with him when there was the accident. He meets her at a bar, and he decides he's going to come clean with her about how he feels about the relationship. And essentially, there is a scene, as if this poor man hasn't gotten himself into enough trouble, and granted, he's trying to undo the trouble that he's gotten himself into. This all just adds insult to injury for him. And after this sort of argument ensues, someone at this bar comes over to him and tries to empathize with what happened, but clearly he has misunderstood what really was going on. And that was good for a laugh. And indeed, this is a dark comedy, but instead of finding it very funny, mostly I found it ludicrous. As I mentioned, overall, the acting is good, though I have to say that as much as I like Mary-Louise Parker, I didn't feel she was well cast in this role. I had trouble believing that she was the mother of these 20-somethings. Even though in real life she is in her mid-50s, she looks and comes across much younger. And while everyone was probably cast based on the energy that they brought to the characters, this family to me looked like a group of mismatched people. They didn't look like they were related to me. Of all the characters, I think Noth's was probably the most over the top, and it looked like he was just having a blast playing this character. I did want to see more depth from him. Eventually he did have some realizations, but it didn't seem to hit him hard. And frankly, what he was losing was huge. So I would have liked to have seen more remorse from him. I will give this movie credit in that I can't say that I've quite seen a love story like this. So often in these stories, there was a breakup, a guy goes after the woman, she resists, but then finally succumbs, and then they live happily ever after. That tends to be the formula, with a lot of back and forth and twists along the way. This movie did not follow that formula. Or I should say, it led us down the path of the formula, but in the long run, it took a different path. I don't want to give away what happened, but I would say it was a refreshing surprise. especially considering the kind of characters that we were dealing with in this movie. So much in this movie was chaotic. From the very beginning, there's loud voices and a lot of activity going on and hard to follow what's actually happening. And then there's a party and there's a lot going on there and on and on and on. But eventually we start seeing pairs of people splinter off and get to have true interactions and conversations that add more meaning to the story. And those moments were such a relief. I was glad that out of the chaos, some level of clarity came about. I would think that you would like this movie if you do live in a big city and thrive on the big life there and the arts. But this is a movie about a wealthy family in New York City. And while there is a little bit of diversity in the cast, it's mostly all white. This family just did not represent the average American family or the average American life. So it's not clear to me how much the average person would relate to this. I do think there is a good lesson in this, but I also think it's probably someone who is wealthy who would have even tried to get away with the issues that were brought up in the first place. So on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being a most excellent movie, I think for what it is, the movie probably gets a 7. But in terms of relevance and likability, I would give it a 4. It is a well-made movie. Maybe it's just simply not my taste. So if your taste seems similar to mine, take that into account. Now stay tuned for the final segment of the show when I'll be talking about the movie Wakefield.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome to the final segment of the show. I'm your host, Elizabeth Aaron. In the last segment, I talked about the movie Chronically Metropolitan. I'm now going to discuss the movie Wakefield. Wakefield came out in 2016. It's an hour and 48 minutes long. It's rated R because there's some sexual material and language. Now, I will say, compared to some of the other movies that I've looked at today that were rated TVMA, this movie does seem tamer in terms of mature content. Now, this is a drama, and it is based on a short story by the author E.L. Doctorow. And the story was adapted for the screenplay by the director, whose name is Robin Swickard. And she was nominated with Eric Roth for an Oscar for Best Writing Adapted Screenplay for the movie The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. And in 2019, she was one of 5 writers who shared the Best Writing Award, and this was granted by the African American Film Critics Association, and it's for When They See Us. She also directed the movie The Jane Austen Book Club. And something else to know about this movie is it is the winner of the Tangerine Entertainment Juice Award at the Hamptons International Film Festival. And this movie has a strong cast. As I mentioned before, it stars Bryan Cranston. He plays the protagonist, Howard Wakefield. And Bryan Cranston is probably best known for the role of Walter White in the TV series Breaking Bad. He was also in the TV series Malcolm in the Middle, and has done a lot of other television. In terms of movies, he has been in Saving Private Ryan, Argo, Little Miss Sunshine, and Trumbo. And for Trumbo, he was nominated for an Oscar for Best Performance by an Actor in a Leading Role. This movie also stars Jennifer Garner. She's also done a lot of television and is known for the TV series Alias. And she's also been in the movies Catch Me If You Can, 13 Going on 30, Catch and Release, Juno, and Dallas Buyers Club. She did win a Golden Globe for Best Performance by an Actress in a Television Series, and that was for a drama for Alias. And another major actor in the movie is Jason O'Mara. He is a winner of the Irish Film and Television Awards for Best Actor in a Supporting Role film for The Siege of Genetville. He's been in a lot of television as well, including the shows Vegas, The Good Wife, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., and The Man in the High Castle. Netflix's summary of this movie is, an unhappy father and lawyer quits his suburban life and vanishes into the attic above his garage, where he watches his family move on without him. And I would say that is an apt description. And this was such an unusual movie. I have not seen anything like this before, for sure. And in that way, it was super refreshing. And Bryan Cranston, he is in, I think, just about every single scene. That is a lot of work, and he did a great job. So to dive into the story of this movie, we get to meet Howard Wakefield. He's a lawyer, well off, he dresses nicely, he has a beautiful briefcase, he does the normal commute thing. In many respects, he is the epitome of what the American dream is. He lives in the suburbs in a beautiful home with his family. He has a job that supports him well. Life appears to be good. The movie opens with seeing him going to the train to go home. And everything is going along as if it is a typical day. Everything is on time, things are working like clockwork. He keeps looking at his watch, he dips into a bakery to buy a bottle of water, and he does some work on the train. Then something happens that is not normal. The power goes out and the train stops, and everyone is stuck in the train for a while. And eventually we see they actually have to deboard the train, and everyone who is on the train is walking to the train station. While the power is out, we see Howard get a call from home, and he chooses not to take the call. This is the first thing that really raised my curiosity. Why did he not pick up the phone when home was calling? And this is where Howard's voice starts a voiceover telling the story. He is narrating throughout the entire story, so we know what he is thinking and what's going on inside of his head. Everything is pretty much revealed. It's almost as if we get a glimpse inside a diary that he's writing, and we get to hear what he really believes. So he makes his way home, and then another odd thing happens. As he makes his way to his backyard to go in through the back door to be home, he has a run-in with a raccoon. And the raccoon ends up leading him up the stairs to the storage room that's above the garage that's detached from the house. He kicks the raccoon out, but then he starts getting curious, and there's a big window that looks right into the dining area of the home, and he sees his wife and daughters there eating dinner. And he is starting to have so much fun just watching them interact, and seeing what they think about the fact that he is late and has not come home or answered the phone. There are moments when there is voiceover, but then there are also these really humorous moments where Howard is voicing himself what he believes his daughters and wife are saying. He's putting thoughts in their heads, making words come out of their mouths, and you can see he is getting so much satisfaction out of being able to voice something that he just hasn't done. He's kept this all to himself for so long. And I, as the audience member, was feeling some relief for him that he had a way to express himself. And part of what he's expressing is his frustration with the level of control he feels his wife has in the relationship, as well as all of these obligations that he must fulfill in order to really take care of his family. And yet, we get to learn that he feels pretty invisible in his family and kind of resentful. And he recognizes that if he goes home so late, his wife is going to question why he never called her. Why didn't he pick up his cell phone? And he doesn't want to deal with it, so he just decides to sit for a while. And before we know it, he's fallen asleep. And he's been out all night. And now he knows he is going to have an even bigger problem to contend with, because his wife, in his mind, is going to jump to conclusions about where he was and what he was up to. So he makes a decision. He feels that he'll have a lot of freedom just being able to watch his family, but not have to interact with his family. So he is going to stay in this room above the garage with the hopes of gleaning how his family really does feel about him. And meanwhile, he also recognizes how little he misses his work. Over time, we get to see the seasons pass. We get to see the decisions that he makes and how he's going to take care of himself. He's testing himself about how far he wants to take this. He doesn't know. And so he's looking for answers along the way. And when the seasons pass, we see how poorly this room is insulated, and he goes through feeling hot and cold in the wintertime. He's essentially really roughing it in order to keep this roof up. Meanwhile, it never occurred to him that he might want to go back home until late in the movie. This happens when he starts to see how the fact that he's no longer there and his family's moved on affects him. They actually start taking his clothes out of the house. They see his golf clubs and golf bag being removed. In the middle of the night, he'll sneak out and he would see his things in a thrift store. He makes a decision that he's going to stay out of the house, but as a result, he is lacking things. He has to find a way to find food. He needs to know how to clothe himself. He has a whole system for how he'll use the bathroom, as well as groom himself. For time, we see that he's actually suffering to an extent. And what starts at the beginning of the movie to be some kind of joke in a way, ends up turning into an exploration that is really a serious look at life's purpose. Now, with the narrator speaking aloud his thoughts, there is a point where the narrator breaks what's called a fourth wall, where he is speaking directly to the audience. And essentially he says he knows that everybody has imagined doing this themselves. And he is the lucky one who actually gets to do it. And for me, this is the crux of the movie. I feel like this story is pretty contrived. I can't imagine this ever really happening. But because it is a movie, we get to live through it vicariously through Howard Wakefield. And so he is a guide for us. He helps to let us live out the fantasy that everybody has had before. Everyone who has had the obligations of work and family and the struggles with money. We get to see what it's like to step away and just observe life as it goes by. Really take a close look at what your life was like. And to decide, would you choose your life the way it is now? Or would you choose something different? And if so, why and how would you? It's really pretty philosophical. And in that way, it's quite remarkable that I stayed engaged with this entire film. I wanted to know everything that was going to happen next. It was really well acted. And this must have been a fascinating role for Jennifer Garner, because most of the speaking parts were really flashbacks or fantasies that Howard Wakefield was having with her. Otherwise, we were mostly seeing Howard just observe her in real time, and it was through a window, so rarely did we actually hear her have a conversation. We only mostly heard what Howard's interpretation was of what she was saying. This movie also used flashbacks really well. Without a whole lot going on for Howard, he gets to ruminate quite a bit, and we get insight into what is going on inside of his mind. And with that comes these memories, and we learned how he got to meet his wife and how he came to marry her. That in itself is a pretty fascinating story. And for Howard, in many ways, it was just a game. And now he gets to question whether it really was a game or was there something more. Through this process, more and more gets revealed to him about what matters to him. In a certain way, this movie reminds me almost of Scrooge. Now, he doesn't have any ghosts or any spirits that are coming to take him on a journey, but he does get to see his life before his eyes in real time, or at least the people who are important to him in his life. And as a result, we get to see him have a metamorphosis. Now, I felt some parts of the story were not realistic. He becomes less and less kept. He looks scraggly, the way a homeless person tends to look. I'll leave it a surprise as to how he gets his food, but it's certainly creative. But it just seems to me that some of the decisions he made were unnecessarily hard, and I didn't buy them all the time. And while I can imagine there is some relief at trying this, I find it very difficult to swallow the lack of empathy that Howard Wakefield had around seeing the pain his departure has caused his family. It just didn't make sense. And there were moments that I wondered if he had all of his marbles. I am not sure that he was in his complete right mind all the time. Besides Scrooge, in some ways this movie also reminded me of Groundhog Day, just in the way that it seems Howard is looking for a new way to try life. And he succeeded. It did lead to growth for him and change, yet there's so many things he could have done besides just watch his family, because he was under a lot of pressure to stay hidden. And the movie tries to explain why he made the choice that he did, and it succeeds for the most part. But again, I feel this is a pretty contrived idea, and the explanations of why he did what he did feel like they were just there to fit the bill. It wasn't realistic. What I did appreciate, though, is that it was the moments when he thought that he was no longer being thought about much in the family, but also when he saw that his family had the potential of being taken away or that his role could be replaced, that helped wake him up to what was really important to him. I'm not going to give away what the end is, but I have to say that I wasn't completely satisfied. So much of the movie was built on explanations of how he came to do what he did and why he did them. And at the end, because we'd seen that throughout the whole movie, there's an expectation that we're going to see that again. And it leaves us without that information. I wanted to know how he came about his strategy for doing what he did at the end. And I felt a little ripped off that he didn't let us in because he'd let us into everything else. So this isn't a perfect movie, but it is a fascinating movie. I liked it more than I thought I would. And of the 4 movies that I watched for today's show, after Breath, this is the second most memorable for me. It is a very unique story. I felt that the story was really well written. Despite the few holes, I felt that the actors were able to do such a good job that I was willing to believe what was happening in the movie. It's more on reflection that it was obvious to me that there were holes. And I like that some of the things that Howard learned were things that I learned anew. I thought the casting of this movie was interesting. I like Bryan Cranston a lot as an actor. I did feel he was a little old for this particular role. I felt he looked old for the part, and I felt he looked old to be Jennifer Garner's husband. And frankly, I thought he and Jennifer Garner made a strange pair. I felt that their chemistry was odd together. Granted, they both did a great job, and they did act pretty independently of each other. I could see why they may have been cast together. They both have sort of a house husband, housewife look to them. But it's something that I just couldn't quite let go of as I was watching the movie. So on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being a most excellent movie, I would rate this movie a strong 7. It's well done, and in fact I think some of the acting probably saved the story to some degree. It kept me engaged. I love that it was unique, but at the same time it was so offbeat and did have some holes. 7 feels about right. I hope you enjoyed hearing about the movies Breath, Burning Cane, Chronically Metropolitan, and Wakefield. And here's to these movies offering you some inspiration. This is your host, Elizabeth Aaron, signing out. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask you to please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review that really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.